Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our Farmers Weekly Question Time event here at the world-renowned John Innes Centre in Norwich. A warm welcome to you all. I'm your host, Johan Tasker, and I'd like to thank our sponsors, Lloyds Bank and AB Agri, for making this evening possible, and indeed to the John Innes Centre for hosting us this evening. Just a few words. It's going to be, I hope, a fun, entertaining and informative evening. Mobile phones off, the housekeeping rules. There is no expected fire drill. The fire exits are marked at the four corners of the room, as it were, and I understand that the meeting place in the event of an evacuation is outside and up on the hill. I know, I'm sorry it's raining. Founded in 1910, the John Innes Centre is an international centre of excellence in plant science, helping to research and develop new crop varieties. It includes the JIC Germplasm Resources Unit, an internationally recognised seed bank for wheat, oats, barley and peas, used by some of the world's best plant scientists, researchers and indeed plant breeders. Our panel this evening, I'm going to go through everybody and then sit down. So I'm going to introduce, first of all, Daniel Zeichner is Labour MP for Cambridge and Shadow Minister for Farming, Food, Fisheries and Rural Affairs, a role he has held for 3 years. He also chairs the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Life Sciences and is co-chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for the East of England, among others. Daniel has a history degree from Cambridge University and while living in Norfolk served as both a parish and rural district councillor. Christine Tacon CBE is chair of Assured Food Standards, which operates the Red Tractor Farm Assurance Scheme. She grew up in Norwich and was director of the Anglia Farmers Group for 9 years until 2021. The farm buying group many local farmers here will belong to, just up the road from the John Innes Centre. Christine was also the first Groceries Code adjudicator from 2013 to 2020. Jerome Mayhew is Conservative MP for Norfolk, Broadland. Jerome was a barrister and subsequently went on to help build Go Ape into a successful tourism business here in Norfolk and across the country. More recently, he's worked in the constituency as a director of an agricultural company, learning about farming and the opportunities green energy brings to the region. He is Parliamentary Private Secretary to DEFRA Secretary Therese Coffey and a member of the Environmental Audit Select Committee. Next to Jerome is Norfolk farmer Rob Mutimer, chairman of the National Pig Association and an AHDB pork board member. An outdoor pig producer, Rob's family farm has 700 outdoor sows and pigs finished in straw-based finishing farms in the local area. He's experienced the roller coaster of Brexit with both the farm and his wholesale butchery businesses potentially affected by future trading agreements. And last but no means least, scientist Dr. Simon Griffiths leads the Designing Future Wheat programme here at the John Innes Centre, and the genes identified in his work help breeders design new wheat varieties fit for the challenge of sustainable food security. So ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together and give our panel a big Norfolk welcome. Thank you. We're going to go straight away to our first question. Amy Russell.
Good evening. I'd like to know how we can help to stop the ever-decreasing margins for farmers while supermarkets seem to always increase their profit margins.
Thank you, Amy. How can we stop decreasing margins for farmers while supermarkets are increasing their profits? Daniel Zeichner.
Well, thank you, Johan. Thank you, Amy. And good evening, everybody. It's very good to be back in Norwich. That is a big question. And sitting next to the former grocery code adjudicator, I suspect she may have a view on this. But we in the Labour Party certainly have a very strong view on this, which is that more intervention is needed. And during the passage of the Agriculture Act, we actually argued, I'm not sure Christine agreed with us at the time, we wanted more powers for the grocery code adjudicator and probably more resources to make it happen. But supply chain unfairness is absolutely critical. And I don't blame the retailers. They do what they do. They're profit-seeking organisations. But the consequences, as you look at it, £150 billion business, which maybe 15 billion goes to farmers, the primary producers. When you look at it, if we want to be a country that produces our own food in the future, and Labour is absolutely clear on this, we want more food produced in the UK, we've got to do something about that supply chain unfairness.
Thank you. We're using shared mics up here, so it might be a little bit awkward. It might be the odd delay. But Christine.
Thank you. I think I've got to put my groceries code adjudicator hat back on again and say that the legislation behind the groceries code adjudicator allowed me to get involved in everything to do with contracts and fairness in contracts, but didn't touch on price. And I think it's because at the end of the day, we have a free market in the UK, and I think that every country that tried to look at regulating the supermarkets got stuck because they wanted to get a fair distribution of the money and the margins in the supply chain. But it wasn't in our legislation, but in everything else, I was able to intervene and make quite a big difference in the way that the supermarkets treated farmers and were treated their suppliers. And there is so much in the way that they treat people that makes a difference. If you've got the pig industry will know this, if you've got guaranteed orders, you've got contracts that can't be changed, you've got to have a notice if there's going to be any changes to them, you can't get charged for consumer complaints, and that become a profit stream for the retailers. There was a lot of areas I could get involved in that made a difference, but it didn't touch on price. And I think the legislation that is now on the statute where the agriculture minister can put something similar in for farmers and their supply chain also doesn't touch on price. I think the answer is the retailers have had a massive shock in the last 6 to 9 months when they couldn't get hold of the food that they wanted. The power has always been with the retailers, and the power is moving back to the suppliers. And it's got to be better long-term relationships, making sure that everybody in the food chain is making enough money to invest and to keep moving things forward. And I think that the food shortages there's nothing a retailer hates more than an empty shelf. And it's not right, they don't make money out of it, but their consumers leave them and go elsewhere. So I hope that is going to start making a difference. But I think the answer is collaboration between farmers, long-term agreements with retailers, and I suspect we will not get regulation. It took 13 years to get the groceries code adjudicator off the ground. So if we're waiting for that, a lot of businesses will go under in the meantime. We've got to stand up and fight for ourselves as a supplier.
Thank you, Christine. Rob Mutimer, this is a particular challenge for the pig sector right at this moment and has been for 2 years or more.
Yeah, it's been a massive challenge for the pig sector, and I would say the people in the industry that have come out well are the ones that have had closer relationships with the end buyer, the supermarkets, which is pretty difficult when you're dealing with Tesco and a couple of the bigger ones, but some of the other supermarkets such as Morrison's and Waitrose especially, and Marks and Spencer's, have given contracts that have a relationship to what the shelf prices of the food. Our contracts used to be all on market price, but now when you get a percentage on cost of production, a percentage on what the pork is sold at retail level, and the percentage of what the market is, it does seem to have levelled out for a lot of those producers. Producers that have just sold on a world market price or a spot price, as we call it in our industry, have really fared very, very badly. The other thing, to keep margins up and to keep people in business, the contracts have really got to be worth the paper they're written on. And I don't think the pig industry is unique in that, but when we looked into it, most of our contracts were verbal or really haven't been updated for 20 years. So we kind of shot ourselves in the foot for many of us.
Thanks, Rob. Jerome.
Right, so I don't think this is primarily a role for regulation. I think the world is moving, Amy, in the direction of power more to farmers, more to suppliers than to producers than to suppliers. The invasion of Ukraine produced a profound shock to the supermarkets, and the length of supply chains has become a real issue, not just a geopolitical issue, but a real economic issue. So I think the wind is behind us on that in geopolitics. As for the market, there are sectors which have benefited from supply chain reviews. The pig supply chain review has started, but before that was poultry. And I think that's something that can be rolled out much more widely across the industry. So that's what government should be doing, and I think it's already demonstrating its goodwill there. But there's something which the sectors can be doing as well, and that's data. So the poultry sector has really good data on their industry as a whole. Pigs, less so. Yeah. And so that's something where if we combine in our sectors and provide really good data that we can have in discussion with government and getting reasonable contracts and relationships with the suppliers, and I think that will go a long way.
Thank you. Amy, do you want to come back on any of that? Have you any thoughts yourself on what should be done? I'm interested in perhaps why you asked the question.
Yes, all very good answers, but I believe that more needs to be done from a government level to almost force these monopolies out of becoming a monopoly. The suppliers are all struggling, be that in the pig industry, in the veg industry, or even the grain market. Although they've seen the benefits from the Ukraine disaster, everyone that I've spoken to in my role as an agronomist is still struggling. And without it coming from the top at a government level, I believe that they'll only keep pushing their luck, shall we say, at supermarket level.
Thank you. Anybody else in the audience like to make a point? No. Okay, so we'll go on to our second question. Alan Georges.
Good evening. My question is, can we have cheap food and protect the environment?
Thank you, Alan. Can we have both cheap food and protect the environment? Jerome Mayhew.
Yes, I think we can. It depends what we pay for. We all know in the room here, I'm not going to lecture you about BPS and Common Agriculture Policy and ELMS, but the basic principle of paying for public money for public goods can focus incentives on improving environmental performance on the farm, both in field and farm and in the wider landscape, whilst providing a very significant and a continuation of state support for farming as a broader business, and allowing the market for food going to the suppliers to be more of a free market, rather than the sort of in my mind, listen, it's just my opinion that the BPS basically got passed through to the suppliers anyway, because they knew you had it, and that was formed part of the contractual negotiations. Whereas with environmental land management, that is a separate aspect of what's happening on your farm, and it will be very different in each farm. Every farm's different, and there will be a different approach in each farm. So I think that is a way that you can focus government support in things which the public will wants to have, which is improved environmental performance, while still having a free market for food, which has provided us with cheaper really good quality food that has benefited our whole country, and most particularly the poorest in our country, for the last number of decades.
Thanks, Jerome. Rob Mutimer, I'm going to come sort of straight to you, really. Cheap food and environmental protection. Jerome mentioned the BPS, and the pig sector, of course, didn't benefit from the BPS. But what's your perspective in terms of cheap food and environmental protection? Can we have both?
My take on it from our industry is that the environmental regulations do cost money, substantial amounts of money in some circumstances. And while that's fine, and it depends what you say is cheap food. If you're going to do trade deals with the other parts of the world with no environmental regulations, you'll find that the product being displayed on the supermarket will soon be coming from other parts of the world. You can ask the customers at any supermarket whether they support environmental issues and welfare issues and come what may, and they'll all say yes, but when they come out at the other end and you look in the basket, you'll find the cheapest food. So yes, we can improve the environment, but there is going to be a cost to it, but we can't do that and compete with in our sector with pork from America, Canada and South America.
Thank you. Daniel Zeichner.
Yes, we can have cheap food, just won't be made here. And that, I think, is the real risk, frankly. And I'm afraid we're not going to do party political stuff tonight. But when you look at the trade deals, you've got to come to the conclusion that there's a real risk, just as Rob has actually said. I mean, the one the other day is the TTP deal. The egg industry is thrown under a bus, essentially, because in 10 years' time, liberalised approach, Mexico, very different standards. Rob's just talked about the pig sector. And we've got to really think about what we're doing, because at the moment, frankly, I do not see an overarching strategy from the current government, because some of the environmental work is very, very good. I support the environmental land management schemes. I wish they were simpler, and I wish I felt confident that people were going to take them up. But the principle of public money for public goods, yeah, I'm absolutely with that. But my worry is underlying all this actually is a drift away from us being a food producer. And George Eustace was always very hard to pin down on whether he thought that we ought to have any kind of target for the amount of food we produce in this country. I mean, these things are not easy to measure, and there's lots of different ways you can measure them. But I've committed, and my party is committed to producing more food in the UK. And I think that's a really important signal, because if you don't have that as your goal guiding you, there's a real danger you drift away to this idea that actually it's cheaper to just get it from other places which are producing food to lower standards. It's a really, really big argument, and I think it's a fundamental difference of view at the next election, so make your choice.
I was a bit disappointed when you said you weren't going to do party political stuff.
That's not party political, that's just stating the obvious.
There's a reason why I'm sitting between two politicians from opposing parties. I do know that Jerome would like to come back on this point.
Well, I think fundamentally it's whether you're an optimist or a pessimist. And because, yeah, we've got trade deals. The most recent one was the CPTPP, so this is the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership. Now, the amount of food and drinks that we export currently to the CPTPP is £2.4 billion. By coincidence, exactly the same amount as all the subsidies that the government pays to farming currently. So the same as CAP. So either you think, yeah, we can go out there and we can sell, we can build economic relationships, we're optimists, we think we can sell our incredibly high quality produce, or you're a pessimist and you say, oh, well, no, they're all going to be better than us. Somehow they're going to infiltrate our domestic market and we can't defend it. And that is a choice at the next election. I agree with him. And I, myself, am an optimist, particularly about our agricultural sector, because we are really very good at it here. And we've got some huge home advantages, quality of our land, our climate. Although it's changing, it's still brilliant. And I think we can go out there and beat them at their own game.
Thank you. Simon Griffiths, does science have an answer for this? Can science deliver both cheap food and protection for the environment?
Well, here at the John Innes Centre, we're at the opposite end of the value chain to the supermarkets. We're right at the far end and the source, but I think we can make a contribution. And I'll give you an example. If we identify genes for disease resistance, pest resistance in a crop, and then we help plant breeders to introduce those into varieties, then that means less insecticides can be used, less fungicides can be used, and that is entirely achievable. The challenge, the market failure that we might encounter in that is that breeders need to be asked to select hard for these things. And that's the challenge. So these are complex market issues, but you can breed very different types of crops which can fit into new types of agriculture and will help.
Anybody in the audience like to make a point? Especially farmers who are being required increasingly to undertake environmental measures on their farm at a time when they're facing ever increasing input costs. Could you just say who you are and where you're from, please? That'd be really good.
Wendy Houston from over the border in Suffolk. I really wish we could get away from this obsession with cheap food, because cheap food is a race to the bottom. And if we could produce reasonably priced, highly valued food with regard for the environment and regard for the health and welfare of the animals that we keep and the customers that we supply, we will be much better off altogether.
Christine Tacon.
You've inspired me, so I was thinking, are all the questions going to be this hard this evening? But you've inspired me to talk about the fact that we need to differentiate British food on the shelves, which is grown to high standards, and to demonstrate to people that if there is cheap food coming in from overseas and they don't want to buy the cheap food, they want to be able to pay more to have something that's been grown to our standards, then that's where the red tractor logo and the Union Jack and everything else comes in assuring people that it has been farmed in a certain way with high welfare. The only word of warning I would say is that the big exporting countries, whether it be Ireland, New Zealand, Australia, are hell-bent on trying to do everything to match what the consumer demands are here. And at Gulf Food, there were adverts of Australian businesses saying they were producing zero carbon or carbon neutral beef and lamb. And we need to be careful that there are other countries that are seeing us as a fantastic market and are gearing themselves up. And I don't think we can always believe that because it's produced overseas, it's produced to lower standards. But I think what we've demonstrated over the last 6 to 9 months in this country is that people will pay more for food if they have to, but they will tend to trade down onto basics and essentials as many more people buying the cheaper range. And I think it's really important that we reassure them that that is still British when it is British, and it's still farmed to the same standards that the premium products are.
I was going to just sort of make the point that it is a difficult argument to make that food is too cheap in a cost of living crisis when food is one of the big drivers of inflation, including the figures that we've seen this week that say that food prices are at their highest for 45 years.
And so much of that is a knock-on effect of the increased price in fuel and utilities. And a lot of the commentary today was about the fact that there's a lag. So although those prices have come down, it's all being built into our cost of production. So the food prices will not come down yet because they were made with those very high prices that were earlier. But it will start to come down, but it's going to remain high for a bit.
Gentlemen, just say who
yes,
you are.
Yes, hello, Stuart Agnew. I'm one of about 5 Norfolk farmers who 20 years ago trialled GM crops. We were very happy with the crops. We were not happy with the eco-zealots who tried to spoil what we were trying to do. In those 20 years, farmers in other countries have been investing in this technology year after year after year to their benefit and to the benefit of consumers. Why will we not be allowed to do this? We have the expert here who can do it. We could be far more competitive if we could use our knowledge. What do you think of that?
We have got a question that's similar to that, Stuart, and I'm going to ask, I'm not going to park that question, but I'm going to ask, because it's a similar question, but Josh Humphrey, if Josh is here, could Josh ask his question? And we'll take those two questions sort of together, because this is a topical question as well.
Thank you. Josh Humphrey, I'm a research scientist with ADAS based at Boxworth near Cambridge. My question is, will gene-edited crops be good for UK agriculture?
So this is, will gene-edited crops be good for UK agriculture? And at the same time, Stuart's question about should we be allowed to use the knowledge that we have? I'm going to come to you, please, Simon.
So in my opinion, precision breeding, what is important, because when we talk about crops and what we do with them and prices, etc., we're really talking about the people who eat them. You know, what do the UK public want? And that's the most important thing in this whole discussion. And for example, I work on wheat. Wheat is an exported crop. There's no way people are going to move into GM or precision breeding until the markets, and that means people, are ready for it. So for me, this is a personal discussion. It's about people realizing that they have a place in this debate, that they have more purchase on politicians, etc., and economists than they probably know, and that the British people need to ask for what they want in crops, become more as informed as possible, and get engaged in the debate. Technologically, of course, there's no doubt GM and precision breeding can deliver some benefits that conventional breeding can't. And if that was the only question, you would do it. But the most important thing is, you know, what do British people want? What do they value in their food?
We have had royal assent for the Genetic Technology Precision Breeding Act, which could pave the way for gene editing. It's something that you've welcomed?
Absolutely, because even if we never see precision-bred crops on UK soil as a farm crop, it's still going to help us to accelerate discovery in the biology that allows us to deliver benefits to breeding more quickly. And remember, it's the breeders who produce the new varieties that farmers select to grow. So it's absolutely, with the precision breeding bill, helps us to do that more quickly, and it's facilitated the process for sure.
As a scientist, do you get sort of frustrated about the debate? Do you see it differently? Are you more philosophical?
I mean, personally, I'm quite sympathetic to people who have the opposite point of view on the deployment of these technologies. It's like any technology, it can be used for many things, and I'll go back to my first answer. It's what you use it for, how you do it, and people have got to want it.
Jerome Mayhew, do people want it as far as you're concerned?
We need to make a big difference between precision breeding, so gene editing, and genetic modification. And it would be a tragedy if those two got conflated in the public mind and thought of as the same thing. So genetic modification, Stuart, I don't know if we've talked about this before, but the public, whether they're right or wrong about the science, and in a sense it's irrelevant, but they have made up their mind very emphatically in this country that GM food is not something they want to see on their supermarket shelves, even if it's labelled. But gene editing, which is in layman's terms, and I need to because I am a layman, it's speeding up what could be a natural process. So it's not taking frog's DNA and putting it in maize. It's speeding up what we would have been doing for centuries anyway, but having a scientific approach to it rather than just trusting to pot luck and random chance. That has huge benefits for this country. For example, you can develop a wheat with a waxy coating, increased waxy coating on it, so that it retains moisture more. So as we become water stressed, as we already are here in East Anglia, you can maintain yields. That's just in this country. Imagine what it could do internationally to help feed the world. There are huge benefits with this. And I'm incredibly proud that we've taken through the precision breeding bill. It did get held up a lot in the Lords by a combination of Liberal Democrats and Labour. And what they were trying to do was to insist that it is labelled, retail labelled, which has the very significant risk of it being conflated with genetic modification. And also they were trying to get animals out of the scope of the bill. which would have been a huge backward step in my mind for the opportunity for improving animal health, to design out through natural processes, but with scientific help, some of the problems that we've got with some of our farm animals for their own welfare. So I'm pleased to say that all of those amendments were defeated and it has now become law. But it's just the first step, because there's two parts of it. There's ability to create regulations for research, and then a secondary one, which is to do with potential production. And this will take years, but I'm very proud that we've taken the first step, and I think it could be an absolute game changer.
Yeah. Look, I'll go to Christine and then Daniel.
I just wanted to say that Simon showed me round earlier, so I learned a little bit about the precision breeding beforehand. And I wanted to give you all some hope that what he said to me, when they're actually doing their gene editing and they're trying to achieve something and they do it through gene editing and create this product that's what they want, even if that product doesn't get grown commercially, they now know what they need to do to develop that product naturally, and they can get there an awful lot quicker. So what we've now allowed them to do is to do tests that they used to need 9 months of paperwork in order to grow a crop. They now only, I think you said you did something in 3 days on the gene editing side, but they can then find the solution and then work out how to do it naturally. So all this work isn't being wasted, even if these crops never actually get grown. And I just wanted to give you that bit of hope. And it really only came out because you showed me round and explained it to me. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Gentlemen there, just say who you are, and just to say to people that we're recording this and hoping to release it as a podcast, which is, I do know quite a few of you in the audience, including you, David, but for the purposes of this, just when you get the microphone, just say who you are and where you're from, and then people will know on the podcast. Thank you.
David Bolton, retired farm business consultant from Norfolk. Correct me if I'm wrong, please, and there's plenty of bright guys and girls in this audience. Since 1995, the Agricultural Tenancies Act has given birth to very large numbers of farm business tenancies. I would suggest that almost every farm business tenancy produced since then is likely to contain a prohibition against GM modified crops of any sort, unless it's approved by the landlord. If that were the case, of course, the landlord might presume some more rent might be necessary. And I don't think anybody pays attention to that particular problem at this juncture at all. Perhaps people would comment. Thank you.
Would you like to comment on that, Daniel, in terms of restrictions on what land is used for?
Well, a whole range of issues there. Let me go back to the beginning. First of all, Stuart, it's very nice to see you again. I think 20 years ago we were political adversaries in a general election. I don't think either of us was successful. You went on to a stellar career in Europe, and I think I lost the argument on that one, didn't I? But we won't go there. But on gene editing in general, I led for Labour on this bill in Parliament, so I've been following it very, very closely. And I think there are some problems. I mean, basically, my party's in favour, because we can see the benefits, but some of us are old enough to remember the debate around GM earlier, and Jerome's absolutely right to draw a distinction. Part of the problem, though, is I'm not sure the government's drawn the distinction in quite the right way, because precision breeding isn't actually a term that means much to scientists, and a number of the learned institutions made that point. Now, I'm not a biologist, but we had some very interesting discussions around biology, because sadly, biology is very, very complicated, and it turns out that the definition that Jerome gave us, which is that nothing externally can be introduced, actually can happen in nature as well. So the definitions are really hard on this, and it was interesting that the government, when at the final stage of the bill, came back with another attempt at trying to define this. Still, I think, struggling to get the definition right. And the reason it matters goes back partly to public perception, but also back to the trade issues, because other countries have got different terms. And when we get to the trading issues, this presents some potential issues. Again, the retailers could make a decision on this, which preempts the government. It goes to your point, I would rather say, that there are a number of people involved in this chain of decision-making. At any stage in it, people could intervene. So I think the key is to try and find a way through this where we get equivalence, if you like, with other countries, but also get consent all the way up the chain, because there is a big goal here. I mean, in the East, in sugar, virus yellows. We've had the debate around neonicotinoids. I think it's generally accepted that however many years the government keeps trying to give another year, that's not going to go on much longer. So what do? Well, what I'm told is that this is the technology that could really, really help us with something like that. So there really is a big goal. I think in answer to the very, very original question is, yes, we will at some point in the future, but the thing that might stop it is if the public gets spooked. And that's why we were concerned about animals. And interestingly, I think George Eustace made this point as well. I think there was quite a debate within DEFRA as to whether it was wise to link the two together. Of course, there are huge possibilities, but the government promised it wouldn't move very quickly on the animal issues until we knew more. I think it's on the crop side where we can probably make quicker advances, but we've also got to be very, very careful about protecting the organic sector, for instance. So there's a very, very big set of issues here. But to go back to Stuart's point, I think in the end, the technology will help us through.
Thank you. The gentleman at the front there.
Mike Ward. I'd like to say that, although I agree with getting food produced in the most efficient and cheap way as possible, I certainly don't approve of GM foods, because we talked about looking after the environment a little earlier here. The problem I've always had with it is nobody seems to be able to assure me that once this thing has started, we don't know how far it's going to go into our environment, our natural environment. The other thing about this business of cheap food, there's an elephant in the room, and that is the supermarkets. How can the politicians control the supermarkets from grabbing all the good effects that will come from producing cheap food? I would say they'll buy it as cheap as possible and sell it as dear as possible to us who wants to eat it.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Anybody else like to make a point?
Chairman, can I just come back very quickly? I don't usually need a microphone.
But could you have one of those, Stuart, please, if that's okay? There's just one coming.
There is an elephant in the room. It's called hypocrisy. The British livestock industry, the intensive one, pigs, poultry, and some dairy, rely exclusively, really, on GM soybeans. These are imported into this country and go directly into our food supply. The public are eating large quantities of GM food, and for them to say they won't accept it is utter nonsense.
Thank you. Rob Mutimer, you're a pig producer yourself. Do you see gene editing as being good, gene-edited crops indeed, as being good for UK agriculture?
Looking at a livestock point of view, gene editing has massive possibilities for us if we could reduce the effects of PRRS as our #1 disease problem in the world. So yes, but if anything goes wrong at all, it's so close in the public's mind to genetic modification that one scare, and I'm afraid the supermarkets, who are incredibly wary, and I hear what Stuart says, but every time we talk to Tesco or anyone about genetic modified food, they back off as quickly as possible. On soya, they'd love to get rid of it out of the supply chain, but at the moment they can't. But as for genetically modified animals or crops going direct to the shelf, I don't think the government has any say in that. It'll be led by the market and the supermarkets totally.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Anybody else before we move on to the next question? Sorry, the lady there.
Hi, thanks. My name's Mia. I'm from the Sainsbury Laboratory. There's a lot of discussion about what the public wants, but have we actually informed them about GM and the fact that we can reduce the amount of fungicides we spray on our crops significantly? What are we going to do about that? Because in my experience, when I talk to the public about GM, they think about Monsanto and an increase in herbicides. So I do think there's a big gap in communication that someone has to do something about it. We need to inform the public. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Christine, do we have as an industry a duty to educate the public about these things? Or is educating the public about things like GM and GE a step too far?
Yeah, I think the thing is that if we told the public how much pesticide and fungicide we use on our crops, they would be absolutely horrified. If we told them how often that we spray potatoes, they'd be horrified. So although we know that the answer is probably a blight-free potato, we haven't told the public what we're already doing to them. And I just think that's far too much of an education program to get to. I think that to produce something that is actually a real benefit to them is where it seems to work. You were talking about some of the ingredients that improve people's health. Maybe I really feel I'm on dangerous ground. Do you mind if I hand over to an expert here?
I think with the public dialogue, one of the problems is if you just go straight to a GM or a precision breeding discussion. For me, the public discussion should be about what do you want? What crops do you want to see? Our farmers take the title of custodians of the British countryside, and they certainly take the title of the people who fill the larders of every kitchen. So I think you've really got to engage with people. Personally, I would not focus on precision or any breeding technology. I would say, what are the things we want as a country, and then talk about how they can be achieved. I think going on and on and on about a particular technology turns people off, to be honest, because it sounds like your agenda is the technology and not the public benefit. So personally, that's the way I would like to, and in the wheat program in the UK, that's how we're trying to conduct the discussion as well. One final point I'd really like to make, the gentleman who made the point about once something's out in the open, where's it going to stop? These precision breeding changes are usually very precise and small changes to the genomes of whatever organism you're talking about. If you go to our gene bank, with the germplasm resource unit on site here, and we DNA sequenced lots and lots of the different crops and different varieties in that gene bank now. The changes that nature produces are much more extreme. Bread wheat is a hybridization event that occurred in the Stone Age between 3 grasses to make a genome with three whole genomes in it. And then it can lose chromosomes, add chromosomes from other species. These are the dramatic changes. They're happening in nature every day. And really, that's something we do all need to understand about precision breeding. It is precise, and the changes are very small.
Thank you very much. I'm going to move on to our next question. It's a controversial one. Ian Spinks. You wait for a microphone and then 2 come along at once.
Yeah, Ian Spinks, ex-farm manager and now beef farmer. Is it time to dump the red tractor on the scrap heap?
I think you know who I'm going to throw this onto. Is it time to dump the red tractor on the scrap heap? Christine Tacon.
Thank you. I knew the question would come up somehow. I hadn't quite anticipated it like that. I think you've asked it in a clever way, really, because it did have, in the year 2000, it was absolutely essential. At that time, there were the food scares over BSE, salmonella, foot and mouth disease. There was a sign up in McDonald's, we've got a picture of it in the offices, that it had in the window, "No British beef sold here." The British consumers' trust in British food was very low. And Red Tractor brought all of the assurance schemes under one roof and created a logo that spoke to the British public and to assure them that their food was safe. We've now got to the point when we do our trust in food index. I think that the last figure had 86% of the public trusted British food, and they trusted it more than food from any other country. So the work that tractor did when it was shiny new was absolutely massive, and to a degree, everything that it set out to do has been achieved. But Red Tractor as an assurance scheme has now been adopted by every retailer, by most food service businesses, because they want to make sure that their supply chain is secure. And just as when you go to a clothing store and buy something, you want to know that that clothing store has ensured that there's no child labour involved in its manufacture. And all of these retailers and food service people are not doing their own audits because they're relying on Red Tractor to do it for them. So if we didn't have Red Tractor, you would be having your retailers, your food service people, to be honest, they wouldn't do it. They would set up another business to do it, so you'd have another coloured tractor coming to do the same thing. But they need to know that those farms are meeting the right standards. And the majority of what Red Tractor is auditing is legislation. And what we're doing when we come to visit a farm, and they are independent auditors that are doing it, and they're all assured to international standards, is checking, largely, they're auditing to check that the farm itself is legal. And there are other things on top, and I'm happy to go into what the evidence is for them. And we at Red Tractor are always checking to say, can we take things out? Can we take things out? And the last time, I think we've just taken out about 10% of the audit points when we do beef and lamb audits. But what we're doing when we're there is to say, can we demonstrate that this farm is legal and that is meeting the Red Tractor standards? And it is one audit that gives you maximum access to every single market. And when I was Groceries Code Adjudicator, one of the biggest complaints I got from suppliers was how much they were spending on audits, and how, that M&S would come and Tesco would come, and I used to grow strawberries, and we used to have almost an audit a week from somebody or other. And what Red Tractor has done, and I don't think many people realise just how efficient it is and how competent it is at actually stopping having audits from all over the place. And even we are getting recognition with government departments such as the Food Standards Agency that says if it's a Red Tractor farm, there's only a 5% chance that we will inspect it versus a non-Red Tractor farm. So it really is providing a lot of value to farmers. And I'm aware that there's people are upset about it and that there's various issues, but I just wanted to reassure you that Red Tractor is actually, in my opinion, a very efficient organisation. There's only 30 employees. The average cost of a Red Tractor membership is £45. It is something that is adopted by the whole of the food chain and is giving maximum access for everything that you produce.
I think that's a no. Thanks, Christine. Could you get a microphone back to Ian Spinks, please? And Ian, I'm going to come back to you in a minute, but while that microphone's getting to you, Rob Mutimer, is it time to dump the Red Tractor on the scrap heap?
In an answer for me, no, but I'm not quite as positive as Christine. From our sector, during our 2 years of problems, we did hold a significant price advantage over the European pig prices, and we held our market share with all the supermarkets throughout that time. And I do believe Red Tractor has had something to do with that. And at times we were up to around 20 pence a kilo, higher than what some of the European markets were. So I wouldn't say that's all Red Tractor, but they have had good things. My problem with Red Tractor is I disagree with Christine that they do the auditing so no one else does. If you look at sectors like the pig sector now, we're audited now by Red Tractor, RSPCA, and then every supermarket has their own auditing system. And Red Tractor becomes kind of like the baseline and the others add onto it, which just we've just bred a huge amount of bureaucracy and we're showing people around the units constantly. So I disagree with you there. I also think Red Tractor, when it was formed in our industry, was a reasonably simple audit. We've had multiple empire builders turn up since then and add constant amounts of new auditing aspects, and I think this has been pushed down from the supermarkets who don't have to bear the cost of what they've pushed down to the producers, and that's been a real issue. And these supermarkets have far too much influence on what Red Tractor does, as far as I can see, and they don't have to pay for it directly, so they're quite happy to push more bureaucracy down at our level. So I wouldn't throw it out, but it does need a very seismic change in the scale of the auditing. Why they audit us as to what fertilizers we've got on our farm when we're a pig farmer, I just don't know. And these are just nonsensical things, and they drive farmers mad.
Thank you. I'll give you a right of reply in a moment, Christine, but to Ian Spinks, what presumably you think it should go?
Am I on? Yeah. Well, I wonder whether it is really trying to achieve the impossible. It's a visit once a year, and does it really check what is really going on that farm? I wonder sometimes whether the work is being done for the HSE, the Environment Agency, the supermarkets, and the farmer has to pay for it. And there have been all sorts of little glitches recently, which I suppose is inevitable, that if you've got such a widespread coverage of UK farmers, you're going to get one or two that slip up. And the other thing that just occurs to me is if food does get short, are the supermarkets going to say, oh, right, well, we can't sell anything because it's got not got the red tractor logo on because it's coming in from abroad? And as soon as they get to that position, then will that not denigrate the value of the red tractor?
Thank you very much. Thanks, Ian. Christine, so Rob mentioned fertiliser inspections. Supermarkets have too much influence, perhaps, and Ian's saying he wonders whether you're trying to do the impossible. Could you come back on those points?
Firstly, the too many other audits. I think it depends what sort of farm you've got as to whether you get other audits, and some of the time the red tractor auditor does do the add-on for the retailer. And actually that's one of my bugbears, and I've asked Red Tractor to draw me up a map of all of the audits so I can actually work out where do I need to go first to try and remove duplication, because some of the duplication is ridiculous and they are asking exactly the same questions that we are. So I actually totally agree with Rob on that. In terms of whether they're being asked questions that they shouldn't, the review that we've just done in beef and lamb was going through every single audit point to say, why are we asking this and do we really need to? And we have all of these committees that are supposed to go through these things, so I'm surprised that something ridiculous hasn't already been taken out. But we do need to maybe do a more thorough review to make sure that we've taken out everything we should, and I think we've just done that on beef and lamb, so we'll get to pigs next. I think the issue of only checking once a year, all we're really able to do, and I think when I ran a business, I found it very helpful having an auditor coming in, and whenever I used to send them to the areas where I felt vulnerable, like when we were paying people in cash and things like that, and said, could you go and look at what's happening over there? Because it's quite reassuring to have somebody independent coming and having a look at your business and telling you where you're doing something wrong. And much as you might not think so, Red Tractor is quite a light touch, and if it finds something wrong, they'll generally give you 28 days to put it right. And we are doing things for the HSE, and we are doing stuff for the Food Standards Agency, but that should stop you being inspected by them, and moreover, it should help you should you have an incident that you have actually done those things that the HSE required you to do. So it is a protection. And your point about will retailers take cheap food from overseas? Yes, they will. And I think that's why it's so important for us to communicate to people that our food is British. And I think whilst we have high standards, the British public has got that message. So demonstrating that product is from Britain, I think, is very important. The Red Tractor definitely has a role in protecting British food from imports. But please rest assured, I am not of the view that Red Tractor is perfect, and it's very helpful getting all of the feedback and we're learning where we need to go next to make it better.
Thank you, Christine. A quick point. I knew this was going to be a contentious one. A quick point from the lady there, and then could we get a microphone to the lady 2 rows from the back, and then the gentleman just there, and I'm going to take them all together if that's okay.
Yeah, Trina Britton, South Lincolnshire. I'm fairly new to agriculture, and one of the things that struck me coming in from other industries is the lack of data management and the support for systems that run through all the businesses. Surely one of the issues here is that burden on farms is managing all these audits and not having the system to support it. And also that there's nothing within the government schemes that I can see that is supporting investment in that technology to make our lives easier.
Thank you. The lady just there. Yes,
Hi,
please.
so I'm Rachel Garty, I'm a vet from the Royal Veterinary College. So I was just going to sort of second that point in that actually some of the new standards that the reg tractor are bringing out could actually compromise animal welfare. So recently it's been said that in 2023 there's going to be decreased euthanasia of bull calves, so not be allowed to euthanize bull calves on dairy farms. If that dairy farm is shut down with TB, you could have a massive overcrowding issue. And I guess my question is, how is the government and Red Tractor willing to support farmers to actually improve animal welfare rather than potentially causing even more issues for them?
Okay, thank you. And the gentleman just there.
Hello, Gavin Pell from Lincolnshire. My point was just regarding the point you raised about Red Tractor assuring British origin. There's been a tremendous amount of scandals recently to do with food labelling, and it does feel to me that the consumer is being shortchanged with the quality of labelling in the supermarkets.
Thank you very much. So we could talk all night about this, I know, okay? So if we could cover off these points quickly. After this session, and this is not to duck the issue, because I would like Christine to address this, but just after this session, we are having a drinks reception afterwards, and I'm hopeful that Christine will be, please let her have a drink, but, you know, don't corner her in the room, but I'm sure she'd be pleased to talk to you without putting words in her mouth.
As long as you give me a tin hat as well,
Yeah.
I'm very happy to listen.
So managing audits and...
Yeah, I got them all.
And
Yeah.
data, yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
First of all, data management systems, absolutely spot on. We have to do a lot more with that. We've got a portal where where we want people to put information on. But I think that's a really good shout that we should get government support to help farmers put the systems in that will actually help them with their Red Tractor audits. So we can do much more electronically, and we do encourage people to use the portal. But actually, not all of the farms have got the up-to-date software, and there is a cost to all of that. So that's something I'd be very keen to have. You were talking about some of the Red Tractor requirements being against animal welfare. I just want to say that we are live, we're real people. If there are issues, if we've got things that are wrong, that are causing things, then you must let us know. And I think Rob would say that during the pig crisis, Red Tractor was bending over backwards and amending standards and allowing emergency stocking densities and things to allow for that. So if we've got something wrong and there's an emergency or something, we will do derogations, and please make sure that you contact us so that we can learn from that. And I think... May I say that there have been 2 packaging issues this year, and I think there's been 3 over the last 3 years where product has been labelled as being Red Tractor when it wasn't, one way or the other. I'll explain a bit more about that. So there's not been a deluge of it, but I will say that I think labour shortages in the supply chain, pressure on prices and margins in the supply chain means that people are cutting corners, and I'm not surprised that some of these things happen. For those of you that don't know, we had apples that were labelled as British but coming from Germany. It said product of Germany, but it had the Red Tractor on, and it said it was from Germany. They were from Germany. We had mushrooms that were labelled as Red Tractor which labelled as from Poland, but they were actually British. In these cases, the product was removed off shelf the same day that we knew about it, and one of them was Mothering Sunday. There were a lot of people at Red Tractor trying to get hold of people at Aldi, and we got those off the shelf the same day. And they were all investigated. So when it finds out, we're right on top of it. Red Tractor appears on £14 billion worth of food. So far this year, we found 100 cases that have been mislabeled, and they were taken off shelf. It's not good enough, but it's not quite as bad as you might make it sound. And yes, I'll happily take lots of questions afterwards.
Thank you, Christine. I'm going to come to Jerome and Daniel in a moment, but Rob Mutimer, you wanted to come back.
Yeah, on what Christine said, yes, Red Tractor, I have to say, were flexible during the crisis, and that was very appreciated by everyone within the industry. And the other thing that Stuart Houston, who's the chair of Red Tractor for Pigs, has actually started to do is he started to have open forum meetings for farmers before changing the standards. And that has at least brought in some sort of willingness for people to talk rather than feel that they're being preached at and changed all the while. So while I absolutely despair of some of the standards and why they're in there, there has started to be some sort of dialogue between producers, but I'm not sure how well they're regulated in the processes, because they don't seem to appear in the dialogue at all.
Thank you. Jerome, should the government do more to encourage farmers to do the right thing, especially in terms of animal welfare?
Well, I think we're doing a lot to encourage farmers to do the right thing with animal welfare. I think you've heard from the experts, frankly, on red tractor, so I don't have a huge amount more to add to that, other than that the concept is the right one, I think. It provides assurance to the consumer about certain quality and the provenance of the food that they're buying and putting in their bodies, and it supports the British sector. If it's working well, it's a really good thing. Where there are labelling scandals, that is obviously illegality. It's a bit harsh to just leave it to the Red Tractor organisation to police that. The government, after I don't hardly dare mention it, but the horse meat scandal back in 2012 or 2013, the government acted as a result of that, and they created something called the Food Authenticity Network in 2015, which is a network of laboratories right around the country that can provide the technical capacity to test the authenticity of food products. And that's part of another acronym, the Food Authenticity Research Programme, which gave the tools, the techniques for doing that food labelling verification. And this all comes under the Food Standards Agency. So this is the structures that the government has set up and are working every day on our behalf. So on the rare cases where this does happen, they're caught, they should be prosecuted. And these should be imprisonable offences, because the damage to all the rest of us by people lying, it's not just the economic damage, but the immediate economic damage, but the damage to our reputations. What can you trust? And we need to build trust always with the consumer. For all of us as producing businesses.
Thank you, Jerome. Daniel.
Thank you. I've found this a really, really interesting and helpful discussion, actually, because I've spent quite a lot of time over my 3 years in this brief pondering the role of the assurance schemes. I think Red Tractor is a trusted brand, and I think it would be foolish to dump it, because it does play a part in people's purchasing decisions. I quite understand the frustration that people feel with some of the bureaucracy. I'm not convinced that if it went, it wouldn't be replaced by another set of bureaucracy that people wouldn't feel equally frustrated by. I think that's part of the modern world. But I also understand the frustration that other producers in other countries are not producing to the same standards. It goes back to the same point we've been rehearsing earlier. So I've been mulling over some of these points. I think it also ties into this question of trust in food. And I think Christine was absolutely right to take it back to the situation 20 years ago, which would bring me on very briefly to just observe that the current debate around the role of the Food Standards Agency, I mean, that was set up in response to that crisis at that time, deliberately highly independent from government, about as independent as it could possibly be whilst being publicly financed. And I think it's really, really important that independence stays. Whatever the rights and wrongs of the way it's currently working, the idea it should be brought back close to government, I think, would undermine its very, very strength. So in a nutshell, all of this is about making sure that customers in shops have confidence in the food that's being produced. And I think Red Tractor plays a role in that. But I think, as Christine has already acknowledged, there are things that can be done to make it work better.
And in terms of that, I know sort of skipping around, well, you might not know this, but the people who've got questions to be asked will probably be thinking, where's he going with these questions? They're all in different order. But I'm going to ask Emily Keeble, because we've touched on this subject, I think it's pertinent to ask your question now. Emily, could you ask your question, please? And this sort of relates to the way that the conversation about Red Tractor has sort of developed into trust in food systems. So, Emily.
Hi, so I'm Emily Keeble from Suffolk. I'm actually a farm auditor carrying Red Tractor audits out. My question is food safety a concern?
is food safety a concern? Should we be more concerned about food safety? Simon Griffiths.
I'm not sure I can comment too much on this. I mean, thinking specifically about elements within my area of expertise, which is wheat, I can't think of any major safety concerns, and so I've really got little to add, I'm afraid.
Christine?
I actually want to talk about food fraud, which I think is what you were talking about. This is a crime. This is where people are bringing in products and selling it as being something else. And clearly there's been something recently, and Farmers Weekly have broken quite a lot of news and got a lot of credit, I think, for the way that you've done it. So congratulations to you. So yes, there are some issues, and but it has been, I think, it has been a decade since the horse meat scandal without it. But I think Professor Chris Elliott is particularly aware of it, and I think it happens, I think, extensively in food service. And it was interesting in our Trust in Food Index that the people's confidence in whether they were getting what they thought they were getting in food service was a lot lower than it is with the retailers. So there's definitely something to be done there, and we are working with food service outlets with Red Tractor to get like the likes of Nando's and McDonald's and things to start using the Red Tractor to try and overcome that. But I think food fraud I don't actually think people are going to be made ill from it. It's just that you're paying for French snails and you're getting mushrooms, and you're paying for monkfish and you're getting some fish you've never heard of before. And that's wrong. That is misleading consumers, and I think that's what Jerome was talking about, that there are ways of checking it. I will just say one thing, which Red Tractor has these traceability challenges. When we will go into a processor, unannounced audit, we will pick up a packet and we will check that product it's got the Red Tractor on has actually gone all the way back to the farm. So we are checking, but there's no way we are there being able to uncover crime, which is why we need this special unit to do it.
Thank you. Rob, Jerome and Daniel, do you want to come back on any of that, or are you happy with what you've already said? Daniel.
Well, just very quickly, on food fraud, I think you're absolutely right about that. I mean, if one looks at the issues around honey that's being sold, for instance, really hard, and the Food Standards Agency, I mean, they explained to me the difficulties of traceability. So there's a lot of work to be done on this, and again, the science and tech may help us ultimately, but it's pretty clear that too often people are not getting what they think they're getting in the food service sector. So yes, but on the question you actually asked about should we be worried about food safety, yes, we should be worried. And I think the Farmers Weekly investigation shows why we should be worried, that there are still things that are going wrong, and some of the suggestions that are being made in terms of the inspections and so on, I think are very, very sensible. But it does go back to that basic question about how we make sure these things happen. And I think the Food Standards Agency's now got a much bigger job to do than before Brexit. I'm not sure they've been given the resources necessarily to better do that. They do their best. I was at the Port of Dover this morning, and I was asking questions about the checking that goes on. And frankly, it's pretty much intelligence-led. So when there were those stories a while ago of those white vans coming across Europe with under 2 kilograms, or perhaps not always under 2 kilograms, of pig meat in the back, we are at risk. I mean, Rob's industry is at risk of the potential disease, and I'm afraid people in this country are at risk sometimes of the food not being up to the standard it should be. But it's a big thing that we've got to do, and we've got to make sure that the agencies that are charged with doing it have got the resources they need.
Thanks, Daniel. Rob, are you...
Yeah, to pick up on what Daniel said about Dover, it's an absolute disgrace on what's been happening. I mean, we've had multiple reports of vans coming from Romania and Eastern European, not with 2 kilos, but 250 kilos of illegal meat that's not been transported, even refrigerated at times. There's been no checks on any of that product since Brexit. The Scottish did do some checks and were finding 3 to 4 vans a day coming in through their ports with illegal meat. And we just leave ourselves open to another foot and mouth or African swine fever, which is rife throughout Europe. So for us, why something hasn't been done, I just don't know.
Well, let's just go on. Sorry, Jerome, you'll see why in a minute, but we can take that because I think this is pertinent. Lance Chapman, to ask your question, please.
Good evening. Yeah, I'd like to know what are the panel's current reflections on UK food security and how do you see policy in the future developing?
Thank you very much. And I know it's slightly different, but it sort of touches on this subject. We are letting food into this country without checks, and I know it's not exactly your responsibility, Jerome, but what are the panel's current reflections on UK food security, and how do you see thinking develop in this area?
All right, I think we're right to be vigilant, concerned always, to see what's coming into our country. I think Brexit is a total red herring. Before Brexit, we had no checks because we were part of the European Union. For non-EU product coming into Dover and elsewhere, there are 4% inspections. There's traceability. There's the full phytosanitary and phytosanitary regime is applied to it. For EU product coming in, they're using or moving towards the target operating model. So this is focusing on risk. So basically applying the most amount of inspections to the areas where the highest risk, which seems like a sensible approach to me. But moving on to the second part of your question, which is about food security. We currently, I mean, we can argue about the exact percentage, but it's roughly about 61% of the food that we consume is produced in this country. I mean, we're never going to grow bananas and pineapples, obviously, but if we grew absolutely everything that we could, then that would rise, it's argued, to about 74, 75%. So that's the margin that we're operating in. The government's position is quite clear. It doesn't want to reduce that percentage at all. It wants to maintain or increase it. And I think there's a degree of consensus, although we would struggle to publicly admit it. I think Labour's view is to maintain or increase as well. So the question is, how do we do that whilst doing all the other stuff we want to do with land? Whether it's photovoltaic, so energy, whether it's putting up houses, whether it's reservoirs, water management, whether we want to increase the woodland to 16.5% coverage between now and 2050. We're not growing any more land, so there is a real tension between the stuff that we want to do in the field, because we're farmers. We want to farm. Our primary objective is to create nutritious food, as well as looking after the natural environment. There's a real challenge there. The government commissioned Henry Dimbleby to produce a report on this about a year ago, and he came up with an interesting stat, which is that 25% of the land in agriculture produces 2% of the food that we have. Now, we're not talking about East Anglia here. It's other parts of the country. Now, that's quite a startling figure. And so when you start thinking about, well, how do we manage, how do we have a framework for land management in the future? You can start to see how through voluntary arrangements, through incentives, you could start to square some of those competing demands for the use of land.
Thank you. Daniel, do you want to come back on that?
Well, it could be a very long answer, but I'll try and keep it brief. I mean, look, UK food security, we think, is really important. We argued during the passage of the Agriculture Act 3 years ago that it should be a much higher priority for government. I think events since then have shown that that was absolutely right. But food security means different things to different people. I've already said our goal is to produce more here. We think that's sensible to have shorter supply chains when the world's precarious. But there's also individual food security. We haven't talked about it much tonight. But the explosive growth in people having to access food banks, the fact that, I mean, stunning numbers of people in our country are actually going without food regularly, which would seem incredible to most of us, but that's what the figures are telling us, and that's what people are telling us. So there's something fundamentally wrong, I'm afraid, with our food system, despite the fact that it's relatively cheap. It's probably because the welfare system isn't working, but it does have an effect on people's personal food security. So we think this is a really, really top important issue. It will be absolutely top of our list when we're looking at this in future. Jerome's right to raise the question of land use. We want to see a proper national land use framework because we think at the moment there's no rational way of sorting out many of these very, very complicated issues as to what you use your land for. But that's probably a lengthier debate for another day.
Thank you very much, and thank you for being succinct in your answer. Simon.
I think food security is not taken seriously enough, and certainly self-sufficiency is not taken seriously enough. Our global food security is based on a few narrow pillars. The staple crops of the world are rice, wheat, and maize. That's where our calories come from. And in Western Europe, that means wheat. Wheat is, more than 50% of the world's wheat is produced by just 5 countries, and we saw what happened when one of those countries, Ukraine, came under such pressure. Countries like India, China are the biggest wheat producers in the world, but they're not exporters, they eat it all. And this means that our major staple is under incredible pressure. All the time, while climate change is bringing in new diseases and high temperature and drought is putting pressure on those very environments where our wheat is imported from. So I think, I don't want to be a scaremonger, but you can't overstate the urgency of making sure our supply of staples such as that is secure. And UK production is very, very important in that. The final thing I'd like to say about it is food security is not just about volumes, it's also about the nutritional density of our food. Wheat is treated as a commodity and investment is not put into its nutritional density. We can get so much more out of these staples. Again, it comes back to our discussion at the start in the first question. It's about the value chain and about how we put value on the crops that we grow and how we're going to pay for them. But in answer to the question, I think we can't overstate the fact that we rely on these narrow pillars to keep the country fed.
Thank you very much. Christine.
I just wanted to make the point that a number of, if we're looking to produce more food in the UK, a lot of people have moved to doing that under glass. And we've lost a lot of food in the last few months because of the cost of energy and the fact that farmers were not getting subsidised prices for energy. And so glass houses and poultry and eggs and poultry barns have been not operated. They've not been producing food. And I think food security is not just something that you need to think about for 10 years down the line. It's what are we doing today to promote food security? We've wasted a huge amount of production at a very, very awkward time because there was not support for farmers and they could not guarantee that if they put crops into those, whether it be poultry or whether it be fruit and veg, they could not guarantee if they put anything down they'd be able to sell it at a price that would give them a return.
Thank you. Christine mentions glass houses being left empty because they're simply not economic because of high energy costs. We've also lost a huge amount of the national pig herd. What are your reflections on food security?
Yeah, I don't think this government has taken food security in its term particularly well. I think they thought that at the beginning of COVID we would see empty supermarket shelves, and then after that they thought that the food chain was bulletproof. Unfortunately, going down the line when you put Ukraine into it shows that the food chain is actually very fragile, and it's caught up with the government because they haven't actually done anything about it. My real worry is if we go back to the Port of Dover, you know, the MPA and the NFU campaigned for a year and a half to get proper checks on product coming into this country. The Port of Dover was ready to do it, and Jacob Rees-Mogg pulled it at the 11th hour. And that shows the lack of leadership and the political will to tackle food security. And we are going to see more empty shelves, and I think not taking it seriously and complexity with the Ukraine crisis is going to catch up with us, and then the consumer will end up paying an awful lot more.
Thank you very much. We've 2 questions left, and Simon's mentioned the impact of climate change. We've not really discussed that at length this evening. But Neil Ward, your question, please.
Thank you. Neil Ward from University of East Anglia, just over the road. What do the panel think needs to be done to ensure the agri-food sector can play its part in helping the UK transition to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, which is not too many rotations away?
Thank you very much, Neil. What needs to be done to ensure the agri-food sector can play its part in helping the UK transition to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050? This is a huge challenge, not only for the industry, but it's probably the biggest challenge of our time. And we often hear that farming has a key role to play in this. Rob, as a pig producer, I know you've other farming interests too, arable, sheep, as a family. What would you like to be done to help you in this transition to net zero by 2050?
I think a lot of our net zero transition has been driven by our supermarket contracts at the moment, and I wouldn't say we're getting anywhere very fast, but at least there is a will to push in the right direction. For us, there's a really big problem in soya, and keeping animals to high welfare standards leads to higher levels of food conversion, which again reduces our ability to get to net zero. So I think we now understand what our problems are, but we don't have our solutions in line. Really, I think it's more for organisations like AHDB to provide us with proper data as to what we should do as individuals on farm, and they're looking at that. And then for government, really, capital grants to help people invest to go in the right direction with it. Because we're going to have to move quite quickly on it, and it is going to be pulled by the market as well, because the supermarkets are absolutely hell-bent on being better than the other supermarket when it comes to net zero.
Thanks, Rob. Christine, can I ask you, in your career, you've seen it from almost all sides, I guess, in terms of retail, in terms of production, and other parts of the supply chain.
Yeah, well, I actually thought the NFU had committed to being carbon neutral by 2040, which is 10 years earlier. And I think my concern at the moment is that it's not being measured. And most people don't actually know what their carbon impact is. And then we've got a plethora of different carbon calculation tools that all give you completely different answers. But I suppose even if you did it, you would have an idea of what's the worst thing that I'm doing on the farm. So I think actually helping people measure. You probably haven't missed the fact that the Scottish Government are giving their farmers the money to do their carbon calculations. I think the Northern Ireland has actually commissioned a large piece of work, and they're measuring the carbon impact as a nation. And Southern Ireland has done a huge amount of work, and Bord Bia, their equivalent of Red Tractor, has carbon footprints actually in its standards already. So I think we've got to measure before we start actually making huge changes. And then I think we need to all reduce our impact, whether it's as an individual or whether it's as a farmer. And the idea of all of this biodiversity offsetting horrifies me. And the idea of people taking farms out of production to plant a conifer tree so that somebody can fly to the other side of the world. I think we've just got to reduce the impact rather than try and do the offsetting. And I just wanted to also make the point, it really worries me that we always talk about net zero as if nothing else matters. Biodiversity matters, food production and food security matters. They're all just as important. We can't look at anything in isolation.
Thank you very much. Simon, Griffiths, if you had a wish list, or you probably have got a wish list, what's on the top of your wish list to help ensure that the agri-food sector can play its part in reaching net zero?
Well, it's one of those things where I think often in science and technology, adversity brings the most exciting times. I hope it doesn't go against the tone of the discussion. But the need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, I think, is one of the most exciting science and technology challenges that we've had for a very, very long time. The other thing that I'd like to point out is that things have changed in the whole value chain in that you see that farmers are really thirsty to innovate and take on these challenges in interesting ways. How we do it exactly is something that we're all still searching for. But it's clear to me that if we work together on this, we can do some of the most interesting, carry out some of the most interesting discoveries of the century. And they would be things, we need the guidance from the wider community to understand what those things would be. But I totally agree, planting trees on farmland is not the way to go. Our crops can be planted to use less nitrogen. We can increase soil carbon. We can increase biodiversity, and that can have beneficial effects on greenhouse gas emissions. So I think all of those things together, again, we need the breeding targets and achieve them as a group. They are doable. And just to finalize that point, I'd like to say, I always say, like, if you went back to 1970 and said to farmers in Britain that they would be trebling their yields of wheat on fields, nobody would have believed it. But it was done because targets were given and the ability, science and technology innovation was put in place to achieve it. I think it can be achieved. We can make big improvements.
Thank you very much. Daniel Zeichner.
First thing I'd say is Neil, the questioner, has written an excellent book on exactly this issue, so I'd suggest that people read his book. And it's certainly influenced my thinking. And one of the things he points out is that farmers historically have achieved amazing things when they're being given clear direction from government. And frankly, my biggest complaint at the moment is there is no plan, as far as I can see, from DEFRA to get us to this point. In fact, the plan is there is no plan. And that is a real problem. It's not just me that thinks that. Some of you remember Lord Deben, John Gummer. It's his, now chair of the Climate Change Committee, it's his constant complaint. So I can tell you, if it's down to me, day one, I'll be saying to civil servants, we need a plan. I think if you have a plan, people can then follow it. It's a whole range of things, some of them have already been touched on, but that's the way to do it.
Thank you. Jerome Mayhew.
Right, so we start, there is a plan, obviously. We've been working night and day on this for years. Let's get our own house in order. This is from memory, but I think that agriculture contributes about 20% of our emissions as a country. A large amount of that comes from fertilizer. And yet in the room, there's Pavel from CCM Technologies, which has it's a startup company. Well, it's more than a startup now. It's with Pepsi and others. But they've created a carbon negative fertilizer. So I'm not, other brands are available, I'm sure, but there is a huge amount of innovation, really exciting innovation in this sector where we think of fertilizers always being very, very carbon intensive. Perhaps it doesn't have to be. And then on my constituency, 5 miles, probably 10 miles away from here, we've got the food enterprise zone. We've got Fisher Farms there. So that is the world's largest indoor vertical farm being constructed right now. And that will produce the same amount of produce as 1,000 acres of land using 50 acres of photovoltaics. So I don't know if that's, that's not the complete answer, but it's innovation coming right now, right here. And the John Innes Centre is right at the heart of what we can be doing. Really exciting science enabled by the new legislation that the government's put in. Then you've got the good stuff that we can take advantage of as agricultural businesses. So carbon sequestration. We're sitting potentially, it's a bit like the 19th century and you discover coal under your fields. It's the other way around, but we've got something which is really valuable. It's suddenly a lot more valuable than it was. So there's an opportunity to layer elms, so you've got public money for public goods, but you've also got the private sector who needs access to carbon sequestration, and they are going to be prepared to pay. It's a really exciting time to be a farmer because you can layer these benefits, both public intervention, but let's get the market operating. Let's have a price for carbon so that the market helps solve the problem rather than creating it. So I know we're short of time. Those are just a couple of ideas, but there's so much more we can do. I'm really enthusiastic about this and optimistic. We absolutely can do it. We absolutely must do it.
Thank you very much. A gentleman just there, please.
Yeah, Tony Bambridge, Norfolk farmer. One of the things that we need is a common carbon accounting standard. And I believe this is something that is very much for government to deliver. Because once we've got a common agreed accounting standard, even if it has to change over time as we learn more, that would open up the market. It would also give farmers something that we can actually truly start to measure and understand we're measuring the same thing. And I believe it is something that's urgent. So whatever colour of the government, we need a carbon accounting standard that is agreed. It's not a partly political issue, it's just a national need.
Thank you. Just very briefly, Jerome. Yeah. very
Just
briefly.
saying, Tony, you're absolutely right. I think there are about 20 different competing standards at the moment. The government's working with BSI, British Standards Institute, to try and bring these together. It does have its challenges because no scheme is perfect, and maybe we've just got to accept that good is better than the best in too long far away.
Thank you very much. Neil, I don't usually sort of throw the question back to the person who asked it, but on the basis that you've written a book, I'm going to ask you. Yeah, what one thing do you think would be really helpful for helping British farmers and the agri-food sector contribute to net zero?
So you only need to look in the Farmers Weekly to see there's loads of innovation and appetite for reducing emissions on farms underway. I think the thing that's lacking is a clear sense of national targets for emissions reduction for the 5-year intervals up to 2050, really. So I think that if there is that national plan with fixed targets, everyone can, they're on the same page and know where we're going. But it doesn't look to me from the Farmers Weekly like there's a lack of innovation and appetite for the challenge.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Our final question, and as I say, we are having a drinks reception after this, but Ali Cargill.
Yep. Last but not least, Ali Cargill, Pit Farms, farmer and contractor. How would the panel feel about giving up their beloved tomatoes, avocados, and eating turnips instead?
A pertinent question in this part of the world. Turnip Townsend, of course. I'm not going to mention the turnip Taliban, and for a certain politician who's not here. But how would the panel feel about eating turnips? And this is, of course, refers, as Ali says, to Therese Coffey's comments, which earlier this year, when the supermarket shelves were devoid of tomatoes and lettuces in some cases. A lot of people, she said, would be eating turnips right now rather than thinking necessarily about aspects of lettuce and tomatoes and similar produce if we cherished the specialisms that we have in this country. I'm going to ask Jerome, it's a bit cheeky, but I'm going to ask him, we couldn't get to his coffee here this evening, but seeing as Jerome is her parliamentary private secretary, I'm going to ask him first.
All right, I'm going to let you into a bit of a secret about that, because round the back of the Speaker's chair, just before that Q&A session in the chamber, we've been talking, and one of the other ministers in DEFRA had a little sentence about turnips, and totally about nothing in particular, but mentioned turnips. And then popped into the chamber, and the Secretary of State mentioned turnips. If she said leeks, no one would have batted an eyelid, but that's where the turnips came from. I think the serious point is that it's about seasonality. So that's the actual point which was trying to be made, and the press obviously just jumped on the name. But we should endeavour to eat seasonally. We should be promoting, as domestic producers, the great things which are coming off the fields at each particular time of year. Seasonality is a good thing. We talked about nutrient density actually earlier on. Having seasonal fresh food is much better than trying to force produce and bring it long distances out of season, and not to mention the carbon associated with flying in Peruvian asparagus all stage of the years. And there is a something wonderful about the 6-week period starting now of eating asparagus now, and then it stops. That's what happens in my garden. But that is not government position. We should be able to get access to produce that people want, and I think we could, there's a lot that we can grow here. I think avocados is a bit of a stretch, don't you think, Rob? But so yeah, we bring in stuff which we can't produce here, but we should be highlighting the great stuff that is available all throughout the year, and I think that's what the Secretary of State was trying to say.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Jerome. Rob Mutimer, how do you feel about eating turnips? Indeed, do you eat turnips?
No. On a serious note to that, my experience before the pig industry was in the salad industry, and I watched plane loads of celery being flown into this country from America for Christmas, and it seems absolutely nonsensical in this world that we are flying in a product that gives you no nutritional value to just to fill the supermarket shelves for 50 odd weeks of the year. So in my view, I think the government should look at a tax on products that are inherently bad for our environment, like celery from America being flown over, to try and stop the supermarkets from being absolutely hell-bent on keeping the same product on the shelf the whole year.
There you go. So no tax on turnips, though. Simon Griffiths.
I like turnips. That's about my only comment.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Daniel Zeichner.
Well, look, the opposition always looks forward to DEFRA questions, and Theresa rarely disappoints. So that was a true cut-through event. It's not always that Thursday morning makes the national headlines. But let me finish on a generous note and say I agree with Jerome. Seasonality is important, and I think it's something all of us would like to promote.
Thank you very much. And last but by no means at all least, Christine Tacon.
I think I would say eat seasonally. Teach people to cook. You know, how do you cook a turnip? I expect there's a lot of people actually knew what they looked like, or maybe didn't even know what they looked like, but wouldn't know how to cook them either. So teach people to cook. I would also say that I think we should encourage as much local production of things like tomatoes, using green energy to heat greenhouses so that we've got it in this country. I mean, we're capable of growing a vast amount of tomatoes here, not avocados, I agree. And I think the other thing is buy British and look for the red tractor.
Very, very well done. I think everybody handled that last question really, really well. But Ali, do you grow turnips? Do you eat turnips?
I eat them, but I don't grow them. But on a serious note, I don't think that this government has covered itself in glory, where I've been travelling through France and Germany and Spain, where the supermarket shelves are full of everything. And our customs system here of getting food into this country, good quality food, our supermarkets aren't prepared to pay enough money for it. The government should be pinning them down, whereas all of that produce is paid for by the French and German and Spanish supermarkets at a higher rate, and yet they're not taking the margins that our supermarkets are taking. So it's no wonder that nobody wants to bring anything into this country.
Thank you very much. Some food for thought there from Ali Cargill. Ladies and gentlemen, that brings to an end question time event here at the John Innes Centre. We're going to have a drinks reception afterwards. I believe at least some of our panel members are able to stay for that. But for now, I'd like to thank our panel, Norfolk farmer Rob Mutimer, Chairman of the National Pig Association, scientist Simon Griffiths, leading the Designing Future Wheat programme here at the John Innes Centre, Daniel Zeichner, Shadow Minister for Farming, Food, Fisheries and Rural Affairs, Christine Tacon, Chair of Assured Food Standards, which operates the Red Tractor Farm Assurance Scheme, and Jerome Mayhew, Conservative MP for Norfolk Broadland. I'm Johan Tasker from Farmers Weekly. This will be released as a podcast on the Farmers Weekly podcast channel, and you'll be able to download that wherever you get your podcasts from. But for now, put your hands together for our audience, and we'll go and get a drink. Thank you.